Hi, this is Professor Michael Dover at Cleveland State University. I would like to talk today about my needs-based partial theory of human injustice, oppression, dehumanization, exploitation, and systematic inequality, and opportunities to address human needs. In this lecture, I'll present a needs-based theory focused on three levels of analysis. First, at the macro level, I have created a typology of three structural sources of injustice: oppression, exploitation, and mechanistic dehumanization. Second, at the level of social mechanisms, I provide a partial theory of how these unjust systems combine to produce systematic inequality in the opportunities people and communities have to access culturally specific satisfiers of our needs. Third, at the individual level, I provide a needs-based theory of the nature of human injustice as we experience it, with a focus on the nature of wrongfully unmet needs and the resulting potentially serious harm. To state the theory in one sentence, this needs-based theory of the systemic sources, social mechanisms, and nature of human injustice contends that three distinct social systemic sources, oppression, mechanistic dehumanization, and exploitation, produce unique and/or overlapping social mechanisms which create systematic inequality in opportunities to address universal human needs in culturally specific ways, leading to the nature of the human injustice theorized here, wrongfully unmet needs, and the resulting serious harm. Starting at the level of macro, oppression in many forms is conceptualized as a social group-based phenomena that is distinct from exploitation. Exploitation is defined in a way that is applicable across economic systems, with the commonality being unequal advantages exercised within the context of structural economic exchanges. For instance, Hanel contended that unjust outcomes are produced by transactions between unequal parties who have a formal social relationship in the context of an institutionalized environment. At a similar social structural level analysis, mechanistic dehumanization is defined as a third social systemic source of human injustice that is different from oppression and different from exploitation. So mechanistic dehumanization is defined as a systemic subjection of human beings to standardized impersonal processes that ignore fundamentally human characteristics and treat us as non-human and/or non-living objects of manipulation and control. Mechanistic dehumanization involves a range of specific mechanisms about which theories emerged, such as objectification, desensitization, denial of need to connect with the natural environment, etc. It also involves other aspects of the dehumanizing consequences of the human creation of Max Weber's shell as hard as steel. And you may have heard this as referred to before as the iron cage. And this is a new translation. And what Marx referred to as the objective transformation of the activity of man as results into an independent force dominating him and inimical to him, and as her, I might add. Moving to the level of analysis of social mechanisms, the partial theory suggests that unique and overlapping social mechanisms associated with each of these three unjust systems produce systematic inequality in the opportunities we have to access culturally specific satisfiers of our needs, from food to water to significant relationships, which are required to meet our basic human needs for health and autonomy, and our basic psychological needs for autonomy, relatedness, and confidence. And we'll be talking about the sources of those two theories. Research based on these established theories has concluded that a minimally optimal level of such needs is required for social participation and to avoid harm. Accordingly, at the individual level, I define the nature of human injustice as a state of wrongfully unmet needs. Absent social intervention by other people, this produces significantly impaired social participation and serious harm. So we'll talk in this introduction. I'll discuss a little bit more. Then we'll have a lit review of human needs theory. I'll explain the original typology, and then I'll fully explain each component of the above theory sentence, and I'll draw some conclusions about the value of the theory. So this theory is considered normative theory. I mean, it's value-laden, and it's, theorizes about the kind of world we would like to see, one that is consistent with widely held moral values. One important form of normative theory is what is known as needs-based social theory. And there's already quite a bit of needs-based theory of social justice, And earlier this semester, you read another example of such theory, the work of David Gill. But arguably, the same thing can be said for theory of social injustice. It, too, could benefit from being needs-based, and that's what I've been working on over the last decade. Figure 1 shows how we can think of a continuum from human injustice to basic human needs to human liberation. Here's Figure 1. You should have this available to you. And it's a good thing just to print this out and have it in front of you while you're watching the lecture. Humanistic normative theory of this kind can support the development of a post-Cold War moral system that responds to the realities of human need, human vulnerability, and human interdependence, respects and enforces human rights, and makes sustainable human need satisfaction our global social justice goal. True, theory alone won't do the trick. Without popular struggle, social movement building, and the challenging of basic cultural, and I would contend, theoretical precepts. If a new social contract is to be achieved, we must theorize and struggle on behalf of the universal concerns, not only of humans, but of all sentient beings. And we must engage in theoretical and social criticism of abnormal and unnecessary social suffering. This theory is presented in that spirit from the below standpoint. My theory rose serendipitously from a combination of personal, intellectual, and political experiences, and from two seemingly separate lines of inquiry, one about needs theory and one about theories of oppression over the last 25 years. Over the fall of communist government forms of state socialism, I opposed taking a defeatist position towards addressing human needs. I published a book review of Doyle and Gough's theory of human need, and I advocated for the inclusion of the concept of human needs for the first time, actually, in the Code of Ethics of the National Association of Social Workers. I further advocated that knowledge of theories of human need and social justice be required for social work education's accreditation standards. Finally, I contributed to the first two entries on human needs in the Encyclopedia of Social Work. The second line of inquiry began with classroom exercises in 1990 that produced the typology of oppression, dehumanization, and exploitation that's used in my article, The Moment of Microaggression, published in 2016 in the Journal of Human Behavior in the Social Environment. This work benefited from my preliminary examination in sociology and from the dissertation research on the social system of real property, both informed by a typology of organizational, institutional, and class analysis, which I relate to oppression, dehumanization, and exploitation in this theory. After publishing a compendium of words and effective phrases describing the moment of experiencing oppression, dehumanization, and exploitation, theory construction began in 2008-2009, when the relationship of these two previously separate lines of inquiry became apparent. So, I was asked by the two peer reviewers of this article to revise the article, to have a solid overview of human needs theory, and not to take make the assumption that people knew about these theories. And so I gladly obliged, and this lecture is based upon that final version. This section will discuss the importance of theory of human need for sociology and for social work, obviously, review the key theory of human need presented here, define additional key terms, and explain columns 2 and 3 in Figure 1. I might add that this is also relevant for a humanistic post-Maslowian psychological theory of human need. Despite considerable sociological attention to human rights in recent years, a number of authors have pointed out there's really been very little attention in sociology. This is to the question of need. This is despite the contention by a major sociologist that an objectivist foundation to human well-being is implicit in classical and recent social theory, and Frieson's suggestion that societal moral systems codified as human rights are an example of the conceptual evolution of humanity. And I'm grateful to Bruce Friesen, author of a book on the sociology of human rights, who is one of the reviewers of my theory. Linz has stressed on the importance of asking questions that have relevance to persisting human needs. Etzioni contended that improvements in human needs theory might correct for wrongs concern about over-socialized conceptions of humankind. In other words, we sociologists have tended to sort of see things as so determined by social structures that we maybe need to look at theory of need. Etzioni is the former president of the American Sociological Association, one of the few who has advocated for the value of these kinds of theories. More recently, Lenski suggested moving beyond Maslow to develop modern theories of human similarities and differences. So, however, with only one notable exception, an article by House and Mortimer, the social literature did not respond to Etzioni's concern. So arguably, why is this? It's a number of reasons. McCarthyism during the 1950s had a terrible influence on our intellectual lives. The plates of the book Common Human Need were destroyed following criticisms of its discussion of socialization, which members of Congress and the American Medical Association thought meant socialism. Second, what Macomber called the triumph of Cold War philosophy just really constrained our intellectual life. Third, Ian Goff, the co-author of A Theory of Human Need that I use, identified 4 competing theories that sort of were more dominant than needs theory for many years. Private preference satisfaction theory, happiness and subjective well-being theory, relational well-being theory and its roots in cultural relativism, and the human capabilities approach. And we'll dissect some of those briefly. Bruce Friesen proposed to move the dialogue from a descriptive analysis of what a society is to what it should be, in order to develop a theory of society based upon democratic human needs fulfillment. And I'm just so pleased to be able to make hopefully a contribution to that literature. So, for instance, take the question of inequality or social stratification. Sand asked an important question. Inequality of what? This needs-based theory of human injustice answers Sen's question by asking about the inequality of opportunities to address human needs. Likewise, Rawls, a major theorist of social justice, asked an important question about social structure. What does a just social structure look like? And that's what's led to the most recent needs-based theories of justice, like those of Gillian Brock in her book Global Social Justice. Finally, Emmanuel Renault asked, but what kind of standard can we appeal to when we demand that social suffering be one of the topics of public discussion and political confrontation? I would argue, as the man did who I photographed holding a sign in a driving rain during the Occupy protests several years ago here in Cleveland. Human needs, not corporate greed, was on his sign. So I would say that human needs is that standard and consistent with human rights. Such unanswered originating questions suggest 3 additional specifying questions which I addressed in my article. What does an unjust structure of society look like? This is answered by my typology of 3 unjust social systems. What does a partial kind of a social mechanism suggest? This is answered by my initial identification of the mechanisms producing systematic inequality and opportunities to address human needs. How can we conceptualize the nature of the injustice produced? I restrict it to something I define as human injustice, which involves wrongfully unmet need, serious harm, and significantly impaired social participation. I don't try to theorize all social injustice. I've constrained my theory to be a needs-based, partial theory of human injustice. So first I will briefly discuss several of the best overviews of needs theory during this period. Hartley Dean discussed theories of need in one of the very first books to really provide an excellent summary of the variety of different theories. And he counterpoised humanistic views of the centrality of need to the prevailing practices of social exclusion, which I linked to oppression, exploitation, and mechanistic dehumanization. In the imperatives of sustainable development, Holden and his co-authors provided one of the clearest accounts of the evolution of needs theory, including theory of human need that we discuss here. But he did not talk about self-determination, which we'll be covering soon. Holden et al. And Ian Goff in his new book on heat, greed, and human need conclude that a conceptualization of the universal human need and its culturally specific satisfaction is required for planning for the sustainability of human need satisfaction for future generations, given global climate change. Gillian Brock, the author of Global Social Justice, in a more recent summary of human needs theory from the standpoint of philosophy, began by noting the many ways of interpreting the advice to distribute, quote, to each according to his need. This is, of course, the famous slogan of Karl Marx from Critique of the Gotha Program, which we may discuss a little bit later. Brock reviewed classical and modern philosophical treatment of the concept of human need. Brock noted that Wiggins acknowledged the distinction between needs that are entrenched and inflexible, which Wiggins considered vital needs that matter morally, and needs that are less entrenched and thus substitutable. In other words, other things could substitute for them. Now, comparing Braybrook's work to Doyle and Gough's theory of human need, Brock noted that Doyle and Gough theorized human need satisfaction as requiring universalizable preconditions that enable non-impaired participation in any form of human life. In other words, when we theorize human needs, the way the philosophers deduced what is needed to avoid serious harm, that they thought deeply about the question of serious harm. And that's so. For instance, earlier you saw that it can't be a substitutable need. It has to be a need that you really can't do without in order to avoid harm. So in Brock's Global Justice, she pointed out that Doyle and Gough provide such a solid bridge between the philosophical literature and that of the social and natural sciences. Of course, Len Doyle was a philosopher. Ian Gough is a political economist. According to Brock, together with Braybrook, Doyle and Gough stressed the importance of social, not just physical functioning, and the value of cross-cultural comparison of how people function individually and in social groups to address their morally important needs, namely those that are necessary, indispensable, or inescapable, and without which they would not be able to lead a life which is humanly recognizable. The present author has also authored several reviews of theory of need in 2 annotated bibliographies for Oxford Bibliographies Online and 2 encyclopedic overviews for the National Association of Social Workers, Encyclopedia of Social Work. So there's a solid basis in the philosophical and social science literature for some of the assumptions made about human needs in this needs-based partial theory. Now, there's a number of conceptual problems that I want to address. The first one considers the distinction between needs and wants. Gough contended that the emphasis of economic theory on wants, or preferences, over needs has produced social policies that not only fail to advance human well-being, but also fail to prevent climate change that could hinder basic need satisfaction for future generations. Now, when Doyle and Gough wrote their book in 1991 on the theory of human needs, they won 2 very important book awards. But it was difficult to sort of penetrate mainstream economic theory with the theory of need, given economists' general emphasis on preference theory in the welfare economics. But in 2015, Gough was successful in publishing his theory in the Cambridge Journal of Economics, which is a top economics journal. And this is a significant achievement for needs theory. And he applied it to the question of global climate change. So another conceptual problem is whether to confine contemporary needs theory to theories of basic survival needs. Theory of human need has been concerned not only with the thin needs associated with basic need satisfaction, but with also the thick needs associated with human flourishing, a broad, expansive definition of needs, not just survival needs. As you'll see, it's hard to distinguish survival needs from needs to flourish. They may be more related than we think. That's an empirical question that requires a lot of research. Theory of human need has already outlined the institutional requirements of human liberation, as well as the relationship of basic human need to the concept of serious harm. Even if one believes that people naturally seek to address both their human needs and desires, lack of access to need satisfiers will produce serious harm. Should human needs be considered universal? That's one of the other key questions. Gough convincingly dismissed concern that the proper application of needs theory would involve some kind of paternalistic dictatorship over needs, efforts by one culture to dictate needs, how needs should be addressed in another culture, and that sort of thing. Noonan distinguished between objective organic life requirements and more comprehensive conceptualizations of needs, and still made the convincing claim that both can be defended as universal. And I've been very pleased that Jeff Noonan was the other peer reviewer of my theory of human need for the journal Humanity and Society. And I've benefited so much from correspondence with him over the years. And I'm really enjoying this whole process of open peer review in this journal, which I hope to publish in. Hartley Dean has suggested humanistic approaches entail inherent conceptions of need because the individual is construed as a relational self must be able to meaningfully participate in human society. And he argues that these needs are universal in all cultures. They're met and even perceived differently in different cultures, but from a philosophical and social science standpoint, they are objectively the same. Arguably, the charge that needs theory is improperly universal is a red herring. A red herring. It just occurs to me that our blood is red, and the charge that our needs aren't the same is a red herring. Maslow long ago recognized that human needs are both universal and addressed in culturally specific ways, and this is an explicit component of both the theory of human need of Doyle and the self-determination theory of Destiny Warren, which we'll be discussing. So as Sarah has noted, the concern should not be whether theories of sameness should be attempted, but whether they are well-reasoned and can be empirically supported. This theory of human injustice intends that we must engage in systematic analysis of within the social group and between social groups similarities and differences regarding the sources, mechanisms, and nature of human injustice. I always like to stress that within group and between group similarities and differences. This is the analysis which we must always make. Another conceptual problem is concerned how to understand serious harm. The concept of harm is central to the moral significance of theories of need. For example, David Wiggins, a major philosopher, concluded that it's possible to identify objective, non-circumstantial conditions which are necessary in order to avoid serious harm. And this is exactly what Doyle and Koff sought to do. Two related conceptual issues concern whether or not concepts such as quality of life and human well-being are preferable to theory of human needs. There are many such theories of human well-being and quality of life. There's dozens of different indexes of variables that purport to analyze them, and almost none of them are based on any theory of need. I think that a number of commentators and researchers have concluded that we should instead rely upon a narrower conception of individual well-being or subjective well-being. What I actually it's not really a more narrow one, but it's constrained to identified concepts of human need as opposed to dozens of variables that are sort of thrown into the computer and used to analyze our well-being. It's those jumbles of variables that are really the narrow conceptualization which Taylor criticized. So in comparing human well-being to quality of life, two other researchers acknowledged objective and subjective elements can be found for each. No one's denying that the universal theories of need that we use here are not subjectively considered in a whole variety of ways, but objectively they're the same needs. But these two researchers show the advantages of a conceptual bridge between theories of human need of Ryan and Deci and Doyle and Koff and various conceptions of human well-being, and quality of life. So according to a theory of human need, the self-determination theory, the individual need of all human beings is to achieve an optimum level of health and autonomy of agency. Autonomy, as broadly defined in the theory of human need, which I will call THN, also requires satisfying the psychological needs for autonomy, confidence, and relatedness theorized by self-determination theory. Both minimally optimal satisfaction of health and autonomy needs and satisfied basic psychological needs are necessary in order to achieve 1. An implicit universal goal of survival and avoidance of serious harm, and to achieve 2. Explicit universal goals of engaging in minimally impaired social participation, according to theory of human need, and eudaimonic well-being, according to self-determination theory. And so we can see my chart here that shows these things. In the middle, in column 2, human need, basic needs for health and autonomy of agency are needed to avoid serious harm and achieve well-being, according to these two theories, and with self-determination theory positing autonomy, competence, and relatedness as the basic needs. According to these theories, while objective satisfiers of basic needs can be empirically identified and the consequences of unmet needs observed, there is no hierarchy between physical and psychological needs. Both are essential for achieving universal human goals related to participation and well-being. However, enhanced levels of critical autonomy and self-determined behavior are required for human liberation, and this requires additional societal preconditions. These theoretical aspects of the theory of human need and human liberation, as theorized by THN and SDT, are illustrated as well in Figure 1, along with the outlines of the theory. So you can see here down at the bottom on the column here for human liberation, one requires preconditions for optimization, which involves universal human needs and various kinds of civil and political rights. So we'll begin with the bottom of the chart at the societal level and move up to the social, cultural, and individual level requirements and characteristics. However, in part because I've given another sort of a video coverage of the chart that I'll make available in another lecture, I'm going to skip through these. Let's focus on the ideas in this particular theory. The text of this lecture is available if you would like to read through this again and compare these sections of the lecture notes with the chart. Human liberation requires a higher level of autonomy, as we were just saying before, what's known as critical autonomy. And to achieve that, you have to have human rights. And you also have to have cross-cultural education and contact with other cultures. So now we're going to talk about my 3 sources of human injustice, which are here on my part of this theory. The rest of this chart was the chart of the Doyle-Lingoff theory of human need from 1991, to which I've added self-determination theory and its basic concepts throughout columns 1 and 2 and 3. And this chart has been approved by both Ian Goff from THN and Richard Ryan from SDT as accurately discussing their theories. My theory is basically here in column 1, human injustice. So what we're talking about now is the sources of human injustice down here. Okay? So social theory has long asked whether injustice is caused by one social system or more than one. For instance, the books Capitalism and Social Slavery and Caste, Class, and Race, a study in social dynamics, discuss the respective roles of exploitation and oppression in human slavery. Debate continues today about the relative roles of 2 systems, capitalism and racism or racial formations, in enforcing social inequality. Such work begged 2 important counterfactual questions. First, would any one unjust social system be possible without ending the other? Second, would any one possibly accelerate the unjust role of the other? Such questions fueled the dual systems theory debate, which concerned the respective roles of class and group-based oppression, in particular patriarchy, in producing injustice. The present typology differentiates not 2, but 3 sources of injustice. I'm essentially stressing the importance of understanding mechanistic dehumanization. Now, sociology has involved at least 3 forms of analysis: class, organization, and institution, which can be applied to the historical study of the 3 social systems of injustice in the present typology. In other words, Marx's class theory can be used to study exploitation, and Weber's theories of social groups and organizations can help us understand oppression and its social group basis. And Durkheim's institutional analysis can be used to study dehumanizing institutions. Now, this is not to say that class analysis can't be used to understand alienation as part of dehumanization, for instance. But as a typology of theories, it's helpful, and this was the origins of the typology. So this typology assumes that the sources of injustice are neither unitary nor mutually exclusive. At the social system level analysis, they are seen as conceptually distinct sources of human injustice. So conceptually, oppression is different than exploitation, is different than dehumanization. I'll try to show why, based upon the work of some major theorists. So for exploitation, I needed a theory that was applicable across economic systems. This typology draws on the work of Hahnel. Like Cudd's theory of oppression, they are applicable universally across different economic systems. Hahnel contended that unjust outcomes are produced by transactions between unequal parties who have a formal social relationship in the context of institutionalized environments. The resulting outcome is considered a product of exploitation. Hahnel noted that unemployment under capitalism leads to alienation and injustice. However, he also pointed out that in any hypothetical economy characterized by free capital and labor markets, even free economic exchanges can worsen injustice, giving unequal advantages to those with a capital advantage. The implication of that theory is that exploitation is not necessarily directly coercive. This dovetails with the observation of the philosopher Ann Cudd that exploitation is not inherently coercive, whereas oppression is. And that's probably the most important theoretical conclusion that Cudd made that made possible my typology. By distinguishing fundamentally the nature of oppression and social group-based oppression, the first two elements of the typology were in place. In most historical instances, it may well have been that exploitation was coercive, but conceptually and theoretically, it doesn't have to be. And that's not unimportant. From a theoretical perspective, it doesn't have to be coercive. And it can take place even in a socialist society because there's still social capital advantages and human capital advantages and financial capital advantages and various other kinds of organizational positional disadvantages in those who are engaged in exchanges. So Hahnel recognized that unjust outcomes can take place in any economy where markets and laborers, commodities, or credit exist. And such markets still do exist and did exist even in the most fully developed forms of communist governed forms of state socialism. Those with more capital could enter into economic exchanges in a way that gave them advantages over those with fewer such forms of capital. Again, capital of many kinds. Tilly developed another interesting theory of inequality that posited mechanisms of group domination as well as economic extraction. Tilly defined exploitation as produced by powerful, connected people and organizations which deploy resources from which they draw significantly increased returns. They coordinate the effort of outsiders whom they exclude from the full value added by their effort. And this was an example of a Weberian class analysis of exploitation, and one that could be applied in both capitalist and socialist economies. So for Tilly, exploitation involved the coordinated efforts of power holders who deploy and command resources, control returns from those resources, engage in categorical exclusion, and skew the distribution of returns in a way not consistent with that effort. For instance, members of the Communist Party elites often controlled who got the choice jobs. As with Hahnel's theory, Tilly's work helps explain how exploitation can produce systematic inequality across economic systems. Taken together, as applied and adapted there, these two approaches to understanding exploitation enable us to understand exploitation in a way that is conceptually distinct from the theories of oppression and mechanistic dehumanization used in this typology and applicable across various economic systems. Now let's talk about Ann Cudd's work on oppression. She addressed the risk of reducing all forms of oppression to a single type of oppression. These included one theory that suggested the value relying upon the concept of social group was a core element of all forms of oppression, whether we're talking about ableism or racism or sexism or heterosexism, all social group based, all based upon social group dominance of a subordinate social group. Cudd identified four necessary and sufficient conditions for social group oppression: a harm condition, linked to identifiable institutionalized practices. So the dominant group is harming the subordinate group. Institutionally and perpetually applied harm to a social group that exists independently of the presence of a harm condition. That's very complex, but this is why us sociologists and social workers, as theorists, rely upon the work of philosophers and economists and historians for some of our thinking. A privilege condition. So there's one dominant privileged group, and then there's the subordinate group. The privileged group benefits from the identified institutional practice. And then there's a coercion condition involving demonstrated use of coercion as part of the identified harm. So harm is done, and we can call it social group oppression if all four of these standards apply. So Cudd discussed direct and indirect forms of both material and psychological oppression. She devoted an extensive philosophical analysis. This is the only full-length book theorizing oppression. And to show that coercion is not an inherent element of exploitation and workplace participation under either capitalism or socialism. On this basis, Cudd distinguished oppression from class exploitation and showed that it's conceptually distinct. And in doing so, she provided an important foundation for the present typology. Now, this doesn't mean that the two don't work together. There's something that's called superexploitation, which is a combination of oppression and exploitation. But that's at the social mechanism level, at the level of thinking about social systems, which are ultimately theorized as part of our social structure. The potential for them to operate in quite distinct ways is possible, and it's even possible to eliminate one of these two things and have the other continue to exist. And there's examples of that. In China, as of the mid-1970s, capitalist exploitation had been eliminated in China. But there were certainly other forms of injustice, including the increasing use of dehumanizing social policies, such as the one-child policy, mandatory use of IUDs that were almost impossible to remove for hundreds of millions of Chinese women, and new forms of highly technological dehumanization that are being introduced, even though capitalist exploitation has now been reintroduced in China. So these systems can continue in place, they can be eliminated, and they can even return. Unfortunately, these three unjust social systems benefit from being theorized distinctly and then observed as they operate very often in tandem with each other. So this article does not attempt to distinguish among or discuss the various forms of oppression themselves: ableism, ageism, heterosexism, racism, sexism, to acknowledge just a few alphabetically. I draw strictly upon Ann Cudd's unitary theory of oppression. So now this is the most difficult social system to introduce and discuss, mechanistic dehumanization. Now there's one other form of dehumanization that Haslam discussed, which I won't discuss because I view it as just similar to Ann Cudd's theory of oppression. He calls that animalistic dehumanization. It's very similar to oppression as Cudd theorizes it. So I'm only concerned with Haslam's theory of mechanistic dehumanization. And I also draw on Maria Kronfeldner's approach to dehumanization. So Haslam delineated two types of dehumanization, one of which, mechanistic dehumanization, is here deemed conceptually distinct from both oppression and exploitation. Mechanistic dehumanization involves the treatment of others as non-human or as even non-living, but it does, and it's not. It treats us like we don't have the core features of human nature. So this involves treating groups or individuals as automata, basically as things, as numbers. That is what this mechanistic dehumanization is all about. So Haslam, his theory of mechanistic dehumanization, unlike his theory of animalistic dehumanization, which is basically oppression as I see it, mechanistic dehumanization can exist independent of two aspects of social group-based oppression: the implicit disdain of one social group for another, and the explicit engagement in social group-based conflict. In other words, mechanistic dehumanization can be very impersonal. It's not based upon one social group. It's based upon bureaucratic systems of control. Only the institutionalized expressions of mechanistic dehumanization are part of this typology. It's used here. Mechanistic dehumanization need not be rooted in any particular social group status. On the part of either those exercising or receiving the dehumanizing practices involved. So dehumanization can be an equal employment practitioner here. You can treat us all as numbers, as machines. Mechanistic dehumanization involves the application to people for standardization, instrumental efficiency, personal technique, causal determinism, and enforced passivity. For Haslam, mechanistic dehumanization involves the objectifying denial of essentially human attributes to people, towards whom the person feels psychologically distant and socially unrelated. A number of other accounts of dehumanization are consistent with such an approach. Haslam and Loughman made clear that the process of dehumanization is both a striking violation of our belief in our common humanity and an abandonment of our Enlightenment assumption that we are all essentially one and the same. Although Freire saw dehumanization as a byproduct of oppression, which Freire saw as fundamental, Freire also explained dehumanization's institutionalized character. Haslam used a trichotomy of humans, animals, and machines in order to identify how dehumanization implicitly and explicitly undermines our human essence. Thus, for Haslam, dehumanization was both a process and an outcome. However, it's used here. Mechanistic dehumanization is a cause of human injustice. Certainly both oppression, dehumanization, and exploitation result in our being dehumanized at the sort of dependent variable outcome of such a process. Here, however, I'm using mechanistic dehumanization as the origin, one of the three origins of human injustice. And there's an author named Macaulay, M-I-K-K-O-L-A, who will talk a lot about dehumanization as the outcome of injustice, which she sees as caused by oppression, but I've written about that in my longer article. I don't have time to talk about that here. But Krohn-Feldner has a wonderful new book that just came out on Saturday, October 22nd, shared about human nature, and she'd also discussed this theory of human need in that book. But she shares with this theory of human justice recognition that dehumanization is a social system which produces injustice rather than being part of the nature of experience of injustice. So that's one of the other sources that supports my typology here, the work of Haslam on mechanistic dehumanization and the work of Krohn-Feldner on dehumanization related to human nature. But continued theorization is underway. This is probably the newest part of the typology. And we're probably going to be identifying a range of specific mechanisms. That's why it's still called this a partial theory, including a spectrum of objectification, desensitization, namely a progressively less sensitive emotional response to the pain and suffering of others. And this has been studied in the military academies by a scholar named Grossman, who talks about the way in which military training and war can desensitize us. And what I call denaturization, the systematic and enforced separation of humanity from the natural environment. So the systematic study of mechanistic dehumanization can contribute to our efforts to understand what Bauman called the gap between the necessary and the real. In other words, the gap between what's going on out there in the real world and what is necessary for us to do to meet our human needs. So one wonderful theorist of psychiatry has shown how medicalization, criminalization, and other dehumanizing approaches can be used by what he calls the therapeutic state, and which social worker Eileen Gambrill has also written about. And another author has argued that patients are dehumanized by such process, but so are the workers within human service organizations. Others have argued that dehumanization is part of large-scale social processes such as industrialization, compulsive obedience, mechanized behavior, and the effects of the scientific revolution. Now, for one historical example relevant to mechanistic dehumanization, Kuhl examined the organizational pairs of supervisors within German organizations to carry out the Holocaust. Now, all of the references here are at the end of the lecture notes. And another example, Ritzer, in his incredible books on the McDonaldization of society, which is, I believe, in now its 9th edition, noted that this is a really irrational system and a supposedly rational organizational structure, and that it's so dehumanizing to its employees it produces inefficiency in the name of efficiency. At least this is my sort of um, take on his book. It produces inefficiency in the name of efficiency, a feigned friendliness that ultimately represents falsity in human relations, pervasive disenchantment, risk to the human need for a safe and healthy work and physical environment, and dehumanization of both workers and customers. I believe that that's a creative paraphrasing some of the things that Richter said, according to Corey Dolgon, Richter's theory demonstrated how the irrational nature of what appears to be rational ends up denying us our basic humanity. So another major theorist of dehumanization is Zygmunt Bauman, a major sociologist. Mechanistic dehumanization can also be understood in ways informed by Bauman's lecture, Observation about Dehumanizing Organizational Processes Characteristic in the Planning of the Holocaust, Hiroshima, and the Gulag, the camps, the prisoners in the Soviet Union. And these are still relevant today. In Modernity in the Holocaust, Bauman further specified, dehumanization is inextricably related to the most essential rationalizing tendency of modern bureaucracy. So from soldiers to corporate officials to human service personnel, which he specifically mentions, Bauman suggests that bureaucratic goals and their attendant routines produce ethical indifference, which trumps the moral demands of human beings who are treated as objects devoid of any claim to justice. So, I've spent quite a bit of time on dehumanization because I think it's the most difficult theoretical case to make. Before proceeding further, I'd like to address a question posed earlier. Is there a fourth system other than oppression, dehumanization, and exploitation that causes injustice? Well, I've been working on this theory for 10 years to try to answer that question. I have not been able to identify one. I identified poverty, but that's actually an outcome. I identified inequality, but that's a mechanism by which all three systems work, and all three systems produce inequality and opportunity. So now, if you can come up with a fourth such system, it would have to be conceptualized at a similar level of abstraction. It would have to not be significantly similar to oppression, mechanistic dehumanization, exploitation. It would have to not be merely a social mechanism stemming from these three social systems. I would be forced to withdraw my article and re-examine my theory. So please let me know if you can identify such a fourth source of injustice that meets these three criteria. So in this section, I parse my theory into numbered component parts, and I explain that a little bit more, which we're going to pass up on. Now, this is the numbered component parts of that longer theory sentence that I showed you before. This needs-based theory of the systemic sources, social mechanisms, and nature of human injustice contends that three distinct social systematic sources, oppression, mechanistic dehumanization, and exploitation, produce unique and overlapping social mechanisms, which create systematic inequality, leading to inequality and opportunities to address universal human needs in culturally specific ways, leading to the nature of the human injustice theorized here, wrongfully unmet needs, and resulting serious harm. So, the craft of theorizing I use is essentially to break this theory down into one sentence and then explain each of the 9 aspects of that sentence. And normally what I would do is go over this chart, but like I said, I won't be able to go over the whole chart with you, but it's right here for those who need it. So I want to make one point here. This is not a deterministic theory. Just because there's these 3 sources of injustice down here, it doesn't mean we're doomed. We're going to have serious harm. We're all going to suffer serious harm. Because you see, there's these human rights down here. So there's essentially, all societies, in order to exist, have some kind of basic system of production, reproduction, cultural transmission, and political authority. And that's sufficient to meet basic needs. So, but people struggle for human liberation. They struggle to establish rights of various kinds. And so, coming from the lower right, there's a sort of a competition between injustice and its mechanisms and the sources of justice and its mechanisms. And it all comes together within specific societies in terms of making available these universal intermediate needs, from water to relationships, that one needs to meet your basic needs. Now, when oppression is winning out, you can produce wrongfully unmet needs, but even then it's not too late to reverse that process. And, you can either prevent it by getting rid of these systems, or you can sort of midstream come along and try to prevent it by preventing the worst aspects of wrongfully unmet needs. And then even later, even when some wrongfully unmet needs have taken place, one can try to restore the meeting the needs of those affected before serious harm has taken place. So this is not a deterministic theory that posits that given a particular condition like the existence of some source of oppression or exploitation, that there's always going to be this serious harm that results from unmet needs. We can struggle to prevent that at least every step of the way. So my theory sees the three unjust social systems as necessary conditions, but not sufficient conditions. So it says, necessary conditions, but not sufficient conditions, is the point that I want to stress. It's true that a causal path from the societal to the mechanistic to the individual level is theorized, but this does not predetermine a particular outcome, either serious harm or even wrongful unmet needs, or even systematic inequality, because every step of the way we have to fight against that injustice. Now, this is because the preconditions for optimizations theorized the preconditions for optimization theorized by Doyle and Goff, which I call universal human rights, laterally influence the extent to which culturally specific satisfiers of human need have been met. So, and this is what I was showing before, and the way in which these needs, these rights here in the lower right, influence the nature of the intermediate need satisfiers that are made available to people. So, in other words, within any culture-specific historical conjuncture, there are struggles and debates over needs. So I'm going to cut through here, and I just want to reinforce from one of my favorite social theorists, as Bertha Reynolds has noted, oppression produces the resistance which will in the end overthrow it. And the same thing can be said of human injustice. Human injustice produces the resistance which will in the end overthrow it. So I'm going to skip through all of the explanations of the boxes. And now here I am displaying the theory. We're going to move through it pretty quick. Going through each sentence, each numbered subsection of my sentence. Okay, subsections 1 to 3 are the sources, 4 to 7 are the mechanisms, 8 to 9 the nature of human injustice. So I've argued before that we need needs-based theory. Needs-based concepts are central to moral philosophy and to needs-based reconceptualization of democracy. Human injustice is a relatively original term. It was used in one sentence by Sklar, who wrote a book on injustice, but was not defined in relation to injustice generally. It's been used in a couple of other books for other reasons, but not really to conceptualize social injustice. So no previous theory has bridged human justice, human need, and human rights, and human liberation the way my theory is done, by sort of trying to show how they're all related to each other. So I argue that there's 3 distinct social systemic sources. We've talked about those. And that there's a competitive relationship between the unjust social systems that constrain opportunities for need satisfaction and the systems of human rights that enable such opportunities. To believe otherwise would be not only deterministic from a theoretical construction standpoint, but it would be defeatist. And the people, united, will never be defeated. The mechanisms of human injustice. 4 unique and overlapping social mechanisms, and these social mechanisms sort of fell into disfavor in sociological theory for a while, but in the last 15 years, people begin to realize you do need to understand how things happen, and you have to identify at the very minimum plausible social mechanisms. And the plausible social mechanism I've theorized overall is the creation of systematic inequality in the opportunities people have. That's observable, it's studyable, you can research that. So this is some more defense of the use of social mechanisms. And so arguably this results in systematic inequality in opportunities to address human needs. And I want to stress that it's inequality of opportunity that produces wrongful unmet needs, not the mere existence of unequal or suboptimal levels of human need satisfaction. Yes, we don't want to see it. We don't want to see people with unequal levels of human need satisfaction. But theories of human injustice stress the importance of the denial of equality of opportunities in order to declare that as unjust. And if you want to read some more about that, you can read the Brock 2018 article, in which he distinguishes between sufficiency-based approaches and other approaches to thinking about moral theory. I don't pretend to understand those fully. This is why we sociologists rely upon our cousins in philosophy and history to help us to develop these fancy theories. So Donald Goff drew upon Rawls's approach to distributive justice, which stressed the role of opportunities, to theorize the negative and positive rights required for optimal need satisfaction. And they showed how economic oppression, here seen as exploitation, can prevent people from having the opportunity and the means to satisfy their needs. So the kernel of this theory was found in the Donald Goff book. What I've tried to do here is make it more explicit and clear, coin it as a term, human injustice, and theorize the role of these three unjust social systems in producing this inequality. So unequal outcomes and levels of need satisfaction are not necessarily unjust, absent systematically unequal opportunities. Mere inequality in access to opportunities to address human needs is not necessarily unjust either. Only systemically generated inequality rooted in one of the three theorized unjust social systems leads to human injustice. Now, I've talked a little bit more about universal human needs in culturally specific ways, and we've talked a little bit more about that clearly there are universal needs and they are met in culturally specific ways and also in environmentally constrained ways. So in different parts of the world, but they're still the same needs. And so Donald Goff put it very frankly, human needs are the same now as they will be in the future, everywhere and for anyone. This is not to say that 20,000 years of genetic evolution couldn't result in some transformation of our species, but from what we were able to see about the human history, these needs have been the same. For the nature of human injustice, it's theorized as a state, and this is sort of original way of putting it that I've developed. It's a state of wrongfully unmet need is one of the two aspects of the nature of human justice. And that leads to serious harm and significantly impaired social participation. So wrongfully unmet needs are wrong because they're caused by, resulting from the sources and mechanisms of human injustice, are theorized and for no other reason. So the three systemic sources of human injustice are normally construed to be unjust in nature. Since the nature of human injustice theorized here is produced by systematically unequal opportunities for need satisfaction, resulting need deprivation is wrongful. Supports for such an approach to wrongful unmet needs can be found in the work of Sklar, who was concerned that the use of theories of distributive justice often resulted in a lack of specificity about what is distributed. In other words, what is the nature of injustice? I'm arguing the nature of it is wrongful unmet needs leading to serious harm. So Wiggins also explained that the avoidance of serious harm requires certain identifiable necessary conditions which are not circumstantial. This would not include need deprivation, which takes place due to non-systemic unfair acts, natural disasters, or other reasons, which are not inherently unjust. Noonan contended that social theory has underemphasized need deprivation. The present theory concurs and identifies human injustice as characterized by wrongfully unmet needs. Serious harm. Need deprivation produces serious harm. Sarah Clark Miller also stressed the centrality of serious harm. It's theoretically valuable to link wrongfully unmet need to serious harm. Wiggins reasoned it this way. A need is something, X, that one must absolutely have instrumental access to in order to avoid being harmed. For McMurtry, N is a need, if and only if, and to the extent that deprivation of N always leads to reduction in organic capability, in other words, serious harm, by which was meant the agent's organic capabilities to move, think, and feel, in other words, to participate. This doesn't mean that all serious harm is a result of injustice. This theory only concerns systematically and wrongfully inflicted serious harm. As McCullough noted, not all harms that we suffer are wrongs. And this is the author I mentioned before, who has a wonderful body of work on dehumanization, as the outcome of oppression, and I don't deny that. It's a wonderful, rich theory, but I'm turning it around and pointing out that the process of dehumanization is a causal factor for human injustice as defined here. So, arguably, social theory is served by this effort to construct theory sentences which say something original and important in a few words. The phrase, from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs, stands out in that regard. I have sought to stress the theoretical importance of the central concept of human need by reconceptualizing social injustice in a needs-based manner. There's one final thing I want to point out. Human injustice exists even if efforts to enforce human rights and other forms of upstream primary prevention efforts have prevented oppression, exploitation, and dehumanization from producing systematic inequality and opportunities to address human needs. Human injustice exists even if midstream secondary prevention efforts have reduced the severity of the effects of wrongfully unmet needs. Human injustice exists even if downstream tertiary prevention efforts have compensated in some way for any serious harm which has taken place and or for the degree of significantly impaired social participation. How can this be? In other words, it might seem like I've just invalidated my theory. Human injustice still exists, even though none of the things that I said as causing human injustice exist. Well, I'm going to explain why that is and show how this actually supports my theory. As long as there is at least one unjust social system identified here, human injustice could still arise. But more importantly, if only basic human needs have been met, human liberation has not been achieved. Until human liberation has been achieved, human injustice still exists. This would hardly be a normative and humanistic theory of human injustice within the Master Division for Human Liberation. So let me show you that chart again. What I'm saying is that even if we eliminated everything over here in column 1, there was no human injustice that was resultant from oppression, dehumanization, and exploitation. We had cut off all three heads of the monster that produces human injustice. We had eliminated oppression, we eliminated mechanistic dehumanization, we eliminated exploitation. Or some of them might exist, but we'd eliminated systematic inequality and opportunities to access needs satisfiers because we'd established wonderful systems of human rights. We passed a constitutional amendment for the right to a job, and we had national health care, etc. Or we'd find wonderful systems of social services and health care to make sure that anyone whose needs were wrongfully unmet had been rehabilitated and prevented from having a serious harm take place. So all this is out of the picture. And all of our basic human needs have been met. I contend it's still unjust if we haven't achieved human liberation. I contend it's unjust if we haven't been able to achieve critical autonomy, self-determined behavior, if we don't have cross-cultural contact with other wonderful cultures, if we haven't established a system of universal human rights, we still have what I would call human injustice, or so I would contend. Conclusions. So we should be done with this in about 5 minutes. This theory of human injustice contributes to the growing body of normative theory within sociology by explaining the continuum from human injustice to basic human need satisfaction to human liberation. The goals of the theory have been to identify three systemic sources of unjust social power, specify how they can produce systematic inequality and opportunities to address needs, and discuss the centrality of the resulting wrongfully unmet needs for producing serious harm. This theory of human injustice has implications for social theory, social research, and social activism. By suggesting the value of a three-systems theory debate, oppression, exploitation, and dehumanization, not just oppression in its various forms, and exploitation, I tried to reopen the dual systems theory debate, which was never really finalized, and to ask, can humanity survive and flourish in a sustainable manner? Can contemporary capitalism address human needs in a manner sustainable across generations, given global climate change? Now, these are arguably the most important social policy questions facing humankind. I didn't ask these questions, but I do believe that my theory can contribute to thinking about how to answer them. So these are not new questions, and these are competing theories. There's a couple of theories here. On the one hand, Goff has expressed hope that well-designed welfare states might conceivably address basic human needs within the context of contemporary capitalism, a regulated form of it. On the other hand, others have argued that capitalism probably cannot be made to operate that would, in a way that would enable us to meet our needs. And Noonan has concluded that an expansively considered state of human need cannot be met without fundamentally challenging property rights. Now, empirical research based on this theory might ask a number of questions at the individual level and in the aggregate amongst individuals, groups, and communities. How is human injustice experienced? Is it experienced via acts of oppression, dehumanization, and exploitation, such as microaggressions and macroaggressions? This is something I've written about. How systemically unequal are opportunities to access satisfiers of human need? What is the mix of various kinds of wrongfully unmet needs? What is the specific nature of the student's harm experienced? There is also a need for class, organizational, institutional analysis of the nature of mechanistic dehumanization at the systemic, mechanistic, and individual levels. Can class analysis show how machinery put to wrong use can transform people into part of a detail machine, as Marx has argued? Can we do organizational analysis of our society of large organizations, of that iron cage that Weber talked about, in order to shed light on possible unanticipated and dehumanizing consequences of bureaucracy and other organizational practices? At the level of social mechanisms, have exploitation and oppression not only produced systematic inequality in addressing material needs, but also undermined the intimacy, identity, relationship, and dignity needs which characterize our species, according to the sociologist Jeffrey Page, who assigned the Dog-Off book, and of course at the University of Michigan in the mid-1990s, after some good degree of debate between him and I on this matter. And he really looked deeply into these notions. And so might mechanistic dehumanization help explain the process of alienation? Progress towards social justice and human liberation can be studied by evaluating the extent of human need satisfaction within and between societies. Finally, research can establish the conditions necessary for overcoming barriers to human flourishing and liberation. Implications for social activism. Just as the dual systems theory debate involves some fundamental questions for praxis, sort of a combination of theory and practice, that could inform social activism, this theory's identification of three unjust social systems has such implications. This theory of human injustice fully distinguishes between oppression and exploitation, but also identifies dehumanization as the third source of human injustice. The typology I've presented is informed by advances in the theory of intersectionality, which recognize that one or more structural forms of power can coexist, and which eschews single-axis thinking. However, consistent with the principle of not constructing hierarchies, this theory does not privilege oppression, mechanistic dehumanization, or exploitation over each other, nor does it imply they can operate jointly. For instance, exploitation combined with oppression produces superexploitation. However, there's a value for praxis in distinguishing amongst the systemic sources. Let me give you an example. In the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, as Andy Charnow, the sociologist who graduated from the University of Michigan near the same time as me, wrote in his recent award-winning book, Neoliberal Apartheid, the leadership of the anti-apartheid struggle adopted a two-stage theory which distinguished between racism, apartheid, the system of oppression as theorized here, and capitalism, the system of exploitation that existed and still exists in South Africa. Charnow identified an alternative theoretical perspective, which he called racial capitalism, which contended that both sources of injustice, apartheid and capitalism, should be simultaneously confronted. However, a strategic decision was made by the tripartite coalition against apartheid, that's the African National Congress and its allies on the left and in the labor movement. They agreed to focus on the two elements of systemic injustice, on the first two elements and to postpone efforts to end exploitation. This is a mistake. The first element of systemic injustice, that would be apartheid, and to postpone efforts to end exploitation. So they had a choice. Could they try to have a revolution and overthrow capitalism and apartheid? They chose not to do that. They chose to negotiate a peaceful ending to apartheid and the establishment of democracy, and to postpone the struggle against capitalism. These decisions were made at a time when one key figure in the anti-apartheid movement gave focused theoretical attention to oppression, and to exploitation, and to a critique of what he called capitalist and socialist economic alienation. Joe Slovo, whom I had the pleasure of meeting in New York City in the early 1990s when he was speaking, said that they arrived at what is called a three-stage theory, in which, after dismantling apartheid, via the National Democratic Revolution, there would be a struggle for a democratic socialism that could eliminate exploitation. However, communism would be required to eliminate alienation or the kinds of dehumanizing bureaucratic structure that we're talking about here. So for the South African liberation movement, a three-system analysis of the barriers to human liberation is arguably of tactical and strategic importance, essential to struggles against social injustice. So I would like to argue that the lessons of the South African liberation movement support the value of a three-system theorization of human injustice as is presented here. So it's important to recognize that not all injustice is produced either by economic exploitation or group-based oppression or mechanistic dehumanization. But it's important to recognize that not all injustice, it's true what I just said, there are forms of social injustice that aren't produced by exploitation, dehumanization, or exploitation. These are the kinds of injustices of one person to another, the kinds of non-systemic forms of injustice and moral wrong that we human beings carry out. But that's not what human injustice is defined to be here. I'm defining it narrowly to be a result of these three things. But it's important to recognize that it's not just economic exploitation and oppression that cause injustice. Mechanistic dehumanization can also play an important role in producing human injustice. For instance, one theorist of dehumanization, Ritzer, noted, dehumanization can produce mass resistance since, quote, being locked in such a cage is apt to be infuriating to most people. So people do not like the iron cage, the shell, as hard as steel. This needs-based partial theory of human justice helps to focus attention on the vexed dynamics of difference and the solidarities of sameness in the context of anti-discrimination and social movement politics. The theories of human injustice, need, and liberation discussed here can fuel social struggles that are less simplistically dogmatic and ideological and more normatively and scientifically, really, linked to recognize moral consensus and scientifically demonstrable unmet need. And they can be more progressively pragmatic. Final conclusions. This needs-based partial theory of human justice draws on theory of need that stress both absolute biological needs, welfare needs, the kinds of needs required to avoid serious harm, and those perfectionist needs required to flourish. I have argued that it is unjust to establish systematic inequality and opportunities to address each of these forms of need, to survive, to avoid serious harm, and to flourish. After all, people do not live by bread alone. For the human liberation we value, we need to be able to dance and to daven, as well as to toil for our daily bread. As Rose Schneiderman said, the worker must have bread, but she must have roses, too. I believe there was another theorist back then that said, I'm not coming to a revolution if I can't dance. Such struggles for human liberation are rooted in our most fundamental needs and our fondest desires. They are struggles to eventually eliminate oppression, dehumanization, and exploitation, and in the meantime to enforce human rights, while we never forget our goal of human liberation. Now, sociology and social work as well, which is an art as much as it is a science, but sociology is quasi-humanistic and quasi-science, according to the late Mayer Zold. Accordingly, we should rely upon not only social theory, but on insights from the humanities. I want to share a couple examples of that. In a recent evening of music here at Cleveland State University from the Protest Canon, here at the School of Music, the world premiere of Running with the Devil suggested that some aspects of the internet represent perfectly amplified devices for our own worst instincts. The same evening, the world premiere of American Monster actually amplified a cacophony of treble instruments, impressing on the listener how cruelty can become so regular as to seem almost ubiquitous. And then finally, in introducing his performance on the piano of The People United Shall Never Be Defeated by the Kia Payun in Chile during the movement there in the 1970s, pianist Geoffrey Burleson hoped that humankind might embrace the universality of solidarity. Then, finally, this summer, I I finally found another country music singer I really like. His name is Jason Isbell, and he had a concert here, and one of his songs had the following lyrics: "There can't be more of them than us. There can't be more. I hope the high road leads you home again to a world you want to live in. But to build such a world requires the elimination of systems of oppression, mechanistic dehumanization, and exploitation. It also requires the institutionalization of human rights in order to establish the social preconditions for optimal levels of human need satisfaction and human liberation. This needs-based theory contributes to normative social science about what it is that we're fighting against and what it is that we're fighting for. It does so by stressing the primacy of needs for analysis of human injustice and for a vision of human liberation. Such a perspective is consistent with the fundamental tenet of sociology, namely the social structures rob us more than we realize of the autonomy we think we have. Disciplining ourselves intellectually to look beyond unitary explanations of social injustice can help ensure we don't view the world around us through a lens which produces a mirror image of causation, one which is perhaps an inversion of reality, the opposite, 180 degrees of what we really see. Even we humanistic sociologists and humanistic social workers are not immune to disciplinary binders that have in the past rejected the use of humanistic theories of need. But as Zygmunt Bauman argued, and yet who are more than we, sociologists, are fit to alert our fellow humans to the gap between the necessary and the real? And then, of course, my favorite social work theorist says, who more than we, who have made welfare our profession, that is the dominant occupation of our lives, are more called upon to work for social justice than the social workers. So thank you very much for this opportunity to present this theory. It's really, although my last 10 years of work, but really the last 25 years, and I am really privileged to be able to teach this course and to provide this lecture to you. The lecture notes will be available to you. And guess what? No test based on this theory. So thank you very much. And I will see you in class or in the online discussions. Bye-bye now.